So we are delighted to be interviewing a man profoundly associated with prayer, with 24/7, as we now say, associated with it as a personal passion, priority, and a reality, and known for his ability to communicate that passion to others. Pete Greig is the instigator of the 24/7 prayer movement and is also the senior pastor of Emmaus Road in Guildford. Pete's known too for his writing about prayer. Two books in particular from the 24/7 prayer movement, Red Moon Rising and Dirty Glory, which turned the unlikely subject of prayer into a series of thrilling international adventure stories. Pete has also revived his interest in the 18th century Moravian prayer movement, which ran non-stop for 100 years at Herrnhut, now on the eastern fringe of Germany. As well as telling many inspiring stories about answered prayer, Pete has also written about an unanswered prayer, springing from painful family experiences, and wrote that in his book, God on Mute. His life also chronicles changes in the practice of prayer from a plug into a power supply approach, as Pete has called it, to a more contemplative approach through a dispersed ecumenical community called the Order of the Mustard Seed. Most importantly, having grown up not only in emotionally repressed, buttoned up England, but its most buttoned up and emotionally repressed county, Surrey, Pete's life has been an antidote to such a buttoned up suburban 9-to-5 repressed Christianity. He had repeatedly said that he was not really into prayer or the power of prayer or evangelism or social justice. His real passion and vision is Jesus, obsessively, dangerously, undeniably Jesus. So, welcome, Pete, and thanks for letting us interview you.
Oh, Jason, it's so nice to be with you.
Oh, that was a lot, wasn't it, to set the scene for you? I've been so looking forward to this, Pete. Now, Pete, as this is an interview in an oral history format, can I firstly ask you, when and where were you born?
I was born in Reigate in Surrey, as you say, a pretty buttoned up geography in the home counties, and I was born on, I suspect it was a rainy day, 26th of November 1968. So I often sort of reflect on the Beatles and all that was happening at that time, but of course I was unaware.
Yeah. Well, I tell people I was dragged up in Luton, made it down to Sutton near Cheam, and have aspirations to retire in Reigate down the road.
Oh, well, I don't know if I advise that or not. I felt very strongly growing up there that I would miss my life if I didn't leave.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, yeah, it's a lovely market town and a nice place to visit. It seems to be the place for restaurants if you want to go anywhere at the moment. Beautiful place, but you escaped there. Yeah. So thanks, Pete. As we've developed this model of long-form biography, which this interview with you is, it's given us a really fascinating delve into people's family backgrounds. And we generally start with grandparents. For example, you've written in Dirty Glory about an ancestor called John George. How do I pronounce this? Is it Govan?
Yeah, Govan, Govan. It's my middle name as well, actually, Govan. Yeah, Govan. It's the Scottish word for smith. There's a part of Glasgow called Govan. It just means smith.
Oh, okay. And he was a businessman and then an evangelist in Scotland. So maybe we could start there. Could you tell us a bit about family roots on both sides?
Yeah, I'm the product of a sort of very Christian wing and a very non-Christian wing that sort of came together. So on my mum's side, it's not just Christians, it's sort of Scottish missionary stock. And I'm enormously grateful for that side. So my mum's maiden name was Govan, and her grandfather and grand uncle, as it were John and James Govan, and they were business people at the turn of the last century in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and really they founded a thing called the Faith Mission, which had a vision to take the good news of Jesus to the rural villages of Scotland, and ultimately then to Northern Ireland as well. And it's still going strong today. There's a big Bible college there, and one of their most famous disciples was a guy called Duncan Campbell, who became the great leader of the last Great Awakening we saw in the British Isles and the Outer Hebrides. So that was John and George Govan. And I always laugh because you see the old black and white photographs of these very stiff and starchy looking men with their big walrus moustaches and, you know, not smiling. And then you read the stories, and that, you know, they attended prayer meetings, all night prayer meetings. And you imagine, you know, what this did for me, like sort of realizing this, they were doing this long before I did it. And one of them, the room shook, and you know, they were really used in revival. So that's my mum's side, and then, you know, there's a strong involvement through my grandfather in the OMF, you know, Hudson Taylor's organization, foreign missions work, and so on. So that's that side. I can tell you about my dad's side as well if you're interested.
Yeah, no, just go on to your dad's side. But before we do that, I mean, how much of that were you, you know, that sort of hinterland to you? Did it mean anything to you when you were younger, or is it something that you've discovered more about or appreciated as you got older?
No, yeah, exactly. I came to both appreciate, well, one, to learn about it, and secondly to appreciate it, and third, to be deeply informed by it. This awareness that we're all bigger than our own lives, you know. And the key moment was when my grandfather died, actually, and going through some of his papers and discovering a quote on a little business card that fascinated me, and it took me on this. I started to ask my mum questions, and found out this link with the faith mission, and found out the faith mission's role in the last Great Awakening, and then I think I write about it in one of the books. But I felt deeply stirred in a way I couldn't explain, and I went to see a prophetic lady in our church and said, "What do I do with this?" And she said, "You need to go to the Hebrides and connect with that story that's in your bloodline." And I immediately got excited and thought, that sounds like fun, and started imagining all the mates I would take with me, and the distilleries we would take in en route, and the adventure we would have. And then she fixed me with a beady stare and said, "And you need to go on your own." And suddenly this sounded like purgatory, you know. But I went, and it was transformational.
Mm. Mm. And how old were you, Pete, at that point?
I was mid-20s.
Mid-20s.
Maybe 26.
Yeah.
About 27, maybe.
Amazing. It's funny, isn't it? Family hands, because I always thought my father called himself an atheist. Found out much later in life that he was confirmed Catholic. And thought I had no Christian antecedents or any religious stuff.
Yeah.
One grandfather nearby. I only just found out recently that he had 6 brothers, and they all lived round the corner where I lived. So where I grew up, I had 6 great uncles I never met, and they were all Catholic. And after the Second World War, they just cut off their Catholic religious tradition. It just stopped. They never.
Do you know why?
Absolutely no idea. And they're all dead now. So that's just puzzled me. It's like that rich, and I've managed to trace them back to Newcastle, and you can see this Catholic church where they were in Sunday school, christened, you know, confirmed, married, and then it's one of the religious mysteries of my family tree. It's just like what happened? Maybe it was just after the Second World War they jettisoned it, but yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? See, I immediately want to start asking you questions about that, but I think that's not what we're supposed to be doing. My dad's side, well, the fascinating thing I think about my father is that he was vastly older than my mother, and so in telling you about my grandpa on that side, it's a generation later. So my dad was born in 1910. But my mother was born in, I think, 1943. And so you know, at the school gates, he was always confused with my grandfather. And this has had a profound impact on my life in many ways. But his parents, William and Nellie, were, you know, lived in Ealing, had a family law practice, Fairchild, Greig and Wells. My dad was, you know, the straight A student, went to Charterhouse, was meant to go and take on the family law firm. My dad, I always thought, was one of two, my dad and my uncle Roger, but then I found out there was another one, a younger brother. My dad was actually the middle of three boys. I'm the middle of three boys. And his younger brother's name was Peter. And Peter, my uncle that I never knew, died of leukemia, I think it was, as a little boy. And at that moment, my grandfather, William, who I never met, really, I think, renounced his faith. He was so bitter and angry at God. Now, he forbade my father from doing two things on pain of being cut out of the family will if he did them. One was to become a Christian because he was so angry at God. And the other was to become a Freemason because my great-grandfather had been a master mason, one of the most senior Freemasons in the country. And my grandfather, William, interestingly saw Christianity and Freemasonry as very similar, as these exclusive clubs. So he told my brother, my uncle, so Roger, and my dad, Brian, you know, if you become Freemason Christian, I'm cutting you out the will. Well, my dad went to Worcester College, Oxford, and met a man there called Jimmy Cox, who impressed him enormously. Jimmy was kind, vivacious, thoughtful, gentle, and my dad discovered that it was because he was a follower of Jesus. Jimmy Cox led my dad to Jesus, and my dad went home and told my grandfather and was duly sort of renounced. So what you have to imagine is this would have been this was just before the Second World War, it's between the wars. So it's Keswick Convention, it's tweed breeches, it's you know, muscular Christianity. And Jimmy Cox died in the Second World War, as did many of my father's closest friends. And one day I look forward to thanking him for changing our family tree. And then my dad felt his great call was to be a missionary in Brazil. This was his great thing. And he went off, as they did back then. You didn't go and join YWAM. He went to a missionary training colony. I don't know where it was, Jason, and learned to play the concertina. Because you've got to be able to go into the jungle and lead worship, and doubtless to do other equally useful things, and language, I suspect. And so there he was, he was single, planning to go and live the rest of his life in Brazil. I do sometimes reflect, you know, if he had gone and married a Brazilian woman, where does that leave me? So then my grandfather, his father, fell very ill. And my dad realized someone had to go and rescue the family law firm. And I've read his diaries. He was wrestling because he felt the call of God to go to Brazil. And this is, his father has actively rejected his faith. And in the end, he made a decision to go and honor his father. And it was the costliest decision of his life, second only to agreeing to join up in the war, which he felt was an evil. He felt it was wrong for him to kill as a Christian, and yet and went and said, put me in on the front lines, I'll drive an ambulance. And they said it's not an option. And in the end, he felt he had to agree to do something evil because it was the lesser of two evils. That was his conclusion on joining the Royal Air Force in the end, in the war. And I think it wasn't quite the same, but he felt he was somehow stepping almost out of the will of God. And he felt that for the rest of his life, he was a nothing. He would have been a something if he'd gone to Brazil, but he became a lawyer, nursed his bitter father, who there was some reconciliation in the relationship. But I'm not sure that his father ever necessarily gave his life to Jesus. And then I guess wasn't cut out the family will, because we've got a nice piece of furniture in the next room from there. And my dad, the cliches are true. At his funeral, the St. Mary's Church, Reigate, was packed with people saying, your dad changed our lives as a solicitor. We have people saying, we came to him for a divorce, he talked us out of it and led us to Jesus, and we're still married. Those kind of stories. And he was remarkable. He would hire waifs and strays. There was a lady called, I can talk about them by name now because they're all dead, Rose Percival, who had lived in Peckham Rye, just off the Rye, all her life, and was a racist. And as Peckham steadily became more and more black, I watched her own sort of neurosis settling in. She was becoming a prisoner. I used to go and visit her, and even when she was very old. Very tragic. But she is a kleptomaniac. She had been sacked from her previous jobs for stealing things. So my dad hired her as his assistant, and then she would come and spend Christmas with us and stay for holidays. She was mad as cheese. But there's another lady who'd accidentally married a Satanist, which I always think is quite a careless thing to do, and phoned one night screaming because he was trying to stab her, and so she came and stayed. There was a lady who taught us piano, who was a refugee, a Jewish refugee that my dad had rescued, and she absolutely terrified us. She was terrifying. But I now realize I was being sent for piano lessons simply because my dad wanted to give us some money. Her name was Josephine. And so there was a sort of wild collection of people in this sedate Reigate, household. And it was because my dad, who felt he was a nobody, spent his life pouring himself out for other people.
Sounds like he brought Brazil to Reigate.
Yeah, you don't often hear that.
Opened a portal, kingdom portal. Let me lean into
Yeah.
a couple of things here, if I may, Pete, listening to you. Again, that, what could have been if you said it was Jimmy hadn't led your father to Jesus, we wouldn't be having this conversation now. Changed your whole destiny.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that. His one phone call changed my entire eternity. The one aunt in my family who was a Christian, a Brethren Christian, and her father is a Mason link here. He worked at Vauxhall and he was a designer, but back in the day he got blackballed on a lot of things because he wouldn't become a Mason, and that was the chat in the family. I'm sitting around with my hard swearing, drinking, smoking, violent extended family, and they would always talk disdainfully about my auntie Betty. Who does she think she is? Basically, she owned her own house, didn't smoke and drink, and didn't beat her kids, so she had ideas of station. Anyway, so I'm left with a mother, 1-year-old brother, and my dad's abandoned us and some other stuff. And my auntie Betty contacts Brenda Moulding. You know the normal Baptist church secretary, you can imagine them. Little Brenda Moulding rings my terrifying mother and invites her to church. And if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have gone to church at 17 and wouldn't have heard about Jesus. And it just is stunning, isn't it, that what God does for our destinies through other people that we owe so much to. I'm just
Incredible.
Isn't it, mate? We wouldn't be having this conversation 24/7 if it wasn't for Jimmy.
And do you see that as the sovereign intervention of God, or do you see it as sort of chaos theory?
No, I see it as God's sovereignty.
Yeah.
That he did that, nudged my aunt to get to look around and go, how could we help? I know, I'll get a church secretary friend to invite. I mean, what were the chances of my mother even saying yes?
Yeah.
She was so anti-church, and the only reason I went was to take care of her. You're like, that had to be an act of, I look at it, think, just
praise God. And you look at all the people that you're raising your family. I saw on Facebook or something, your brother, gorgeous.
Yeah, he's a Christian now, preaching in a HTB church plant. It's like, it's just destiny. I share that in our church context. That when it comes to evangelism, we think it has to be something huge or spectacular. It can just be a tentative phone call. Maybe this might help. It can change destinies forever.
Yeah.
So let me. Yeah, can I lean into something about your dad just listening that came to mind? I was thinking about you said your dad was born in 1910.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt something when I've met people who are much older. You can connect. Feels like you can lean back into history. I was on a mission thing once. A Japanese guy that presented. He was 104 years old, and he had a young man who was 83 that was carrying his bag as his assistant. Hilarious. But I will never forget when I stood in front of him, and in between naps, when he looked up, put his hand on me, and blessed me. Wow. And I had that sense of, you think Jesus was 2,000 years ago, suddenly there was only 20 of him to Jesus. Suddenly Jesus of history was very, very close when you're in the presence of people who have been through so much of history. So I guess that came to mind, and I was wondering if I can ask the question. I hope I don't ask it inexpertly or inadvertently. Just, did you have that sense with your father, and do you carry it with you? Not just that he was 30 years older than your mother, but he reached back to 1910. Do you feel that yourself?
Yes, deeply. I feel a strong sense both of the human connection that you're describing, and that principle as well geographically. When we lived in America, the thing I missed most was ghosts, by which I mean everything always seemed to have to be new in America, in the Midwest of America. And I missed the oldness of things. And if I can say this without sounding unchristian, almost the spirit of place, that connection you have when you live in old Europe or old Japan or wherever, of connection with that which has gone before, and the gift it gives us of being able to think in centuries and not just decades. So, and it's interesting, isn't it, how science is now showing that trauma and stress by your parents or even your grandparents can physically affect you, and it's extraordinary. So, without wanting to become too psychoanalytical of myself, I am certain that I grew up with an unusual awareness of the shortness of life and mortality, because my dad, I don't know if this was right of him or not, but would regularly say, Pete, old boy, I won't always be around, which does something to a little boy, because at the time in life when you're meant to believe that your dad is immortal, eternal, and infinitely wise, he was continually hanging around stage left, and I know that some of probably the unhealthy drive that I have is this sense of needing to make every moment count because life is really short. what's interesting is my peers are now catching up with me because we're just getting on a bit. So everyone's coming to terms with their mortality. But I've had that since I was 12. You know, I remember distinctly being on holiday on the Isle of Wight. I don't know what age I was. I was very young, and sobbing in my bed with the discovery, the revelation that my parents would soon die. I was as if I was going through that trauma. It was that moment of realization. So, but I also think that's probably one of God's redemptive gifts to me, because I was never comfortable to sit around in Reigate biding my time. I mean, even if we went out for an evening, I'm like, let's not do this. Let's climb the South Downs, light a fire, and write a song. It's just this constant, let's live. So I'm very grateful, both with the connection with the past through an older dad, but also that sense of the opportunity and urgency of life.
Yeah. Makes me wonder what the soundtrack to your life was at 12. What was music accompanied you through that phase?
It was bad music back then, wasn't it? But remember, you have to remember, my mother's sort of Presbyterian missionary side won out in the home, because my dad was so old. So it was a bit like being raised by a single parent at times. My dad was often asleep and unwell. You know, never would have played football with us or any of that sort of stuff. And so for all that I'm grateful about, and there's much I'm grateful about in my mum's tradition, they weren't that good at having fun. And there was a lot of kind of guilt around. And so our home wasn't filled. You know, I think there was sort of Holst's The Planets and and James Galway's Magic Flute. But, you know, pop music was not, that was my discovery as a teenager, because you know, there was none of that sort of stuff in the house.
Yeah. So how were you accessing it? Secretly on a transistor radio?
No, they weren't resistant. So, you know, but we didn't have a telly. You know, again, it was that slightly ascetic side. We didn't have a telly for many years. So eventually we got a small black and white thing. It's a funny old thing, you know, that culture, it really is a culture. There's a lot of them out there. They do the same things everyone else. They just do it 10 years later. You know, it's not they don't get tellies. They just get them 10 years after everyone else, or they get a black and white one when everyone's got a color one. So we were just 10 years behind. But yeah, probably TV. Record. Did you ever record cassettes off the radio?
Oh yeah.
You know?
Did you do the charts on a Sunday night and you'd sit there and record
yeah.
And then if you were lucky, you'd be making a mixtape for the lady that you were trying to impress. Did you ever do that?
Oh yeah. And the annoyance when the DJ did a slow fade and spoke over the end because you wanted to hit pause at the end of the song.
See, I'll try telling my kids about this. You and I are almost the same age, and they look at me. They're all millennials, and it's like, was there ever a world when you couldn't just download what you want when you want it? The idea that you have to sit there and press.
I know. And they are now having. We've had the vinyl revolution, right?
Yeah.
You probably know those guys are now getting into cassette tapes, and I'm like, guys, I can save you a lot of time here. They're crap.
You beat the bit when the bit you break off to stop it recording, and then you have to put sellotape over it, wouldn't you, so that you could record over. Do you remember all of that? And
the pencil through to rewind, you know, and they stretch. You can't. I mean, the whole thing was just.
And then in my word, it was always the rich kids that had the TDK, the metal tapes, you know.
Yes.
For their recording.
Yeah.
So,
was it C60 and C90?
Yeah.
I think it was C45 as well.
Yeah, gold dear, we're showing our age now, aren't we? There you go.
What was your first single? Jason?
Yeah. Can you say it out loud? Nick Kershaw.
Tree by a River.
Yep.
There's a tree by a river, there's a hole in the ground where old man Aaron goes around. And I got the 12-inch single of that.
Did you? Oh, do you know the version I had? It was actually in the shape of the letter K.
Oh my goodness.
Single. I wish I had kept it. Could you imagine it? I mean, I don't know what happened to it. I wish I'd kept it. It was just fantastic. Right, we better not sing any more of our songs. So can I dig into a little bit about your parents, Pete? Because often when we're doing these interviews, we're finding out how quite often people's parents are temperamentally quite different. I mean, you've already told us a little bit about how, you know, there was your age and backgrounds that were different. But how did your parents work together, complement each other, and where were they different to each other? What any other dynamics that you remember?
Well, I think my dad was probably a pretty good fun in his time, but I'm not sure that I necessarily intersected with that, because most of my memories of him are a relatively old and unwell man. But everything I can discover about him and the way people talk about him, he was very sociable, you know, and, you know, could hold his own in a bar and all that stuff. Whereas my mum, you know, had the sort of resilience and strength, but also the seriousness and sobriety of that sort of Scottish Christian missionary tradition. So they connected really around faith. You know, I mean, I'm sure you'll be asking something along these lines with all your interviewees, Jason. But I'm pretty convinced I can give you the most extreme answer, because my you know, my dad was family friends with my grandfather. In fact, was a year older. My father was a year older than my grandfather, and they were buddies. So my dad first got to know my grandparents, Eustace and Grace Govan, in Edinburgh, or Kilmacombe, or wherever they were up there in Scotland. He was in the Air Force, relatively newly saved, and was given the address of a nice Christian couple that he was told, if you go there, they'll let you have a bath. So he turned up at my grandparents' house for a bath, because it is like the Freemasons, isn't it? Like you're in the club. And they became family friends. My dad was perceived to be this sophisticated London lawyer, you know, who'd had a privileged upbringing, public school and all that stuff. And my grandparents were, you know, these relatively unsophisticated Scots. But my mom, who was his only child, grew up with this figure, Uncle Brian, who would be her husband. And she has admitted to me that he was sort of the best off person that they knew. And she always thought, if anyone's ever going to buy me a pony, it might be him. I mean, you know, a shrink could have a go on this. And then he was incredibly sort of proper. I mean, this is a man who wore a tie on the beach on a holiday. And he eventually, you know, my mum went off to university in Edinburgh and became a teacher. And my dad realized he had feelings for her. And being proper, he wrote to my grandfather and said, I'm afraid I can't come and see you anymore. I'm incredibly embarrassed to admit, but I've started to have feelings for your daughter. And my grandfather was appalled. I mean, people would be appalled now, I think. You know, it would be shocking now. And of course, it'd be seen more salaciously now. But it was pretty shocking back then. So my grandfather said, well, quite right, you better not come. And then my grandmother found out that her only daughter, Jill, my mother, had a big fat crush on Uncle Brian. And they thought, help, we can never let the two of them articulate this to each other. So they sent my mum off, as I understand it, on a walking holiday in Norway to get over it.
Is that a Presbyterian thing to do? We'll deal with your hormones by sending you on a walking holiday in Norway.
So
I should do it with my kids. I'm getting ideas from my kids now.
It didn't work, Jason. So then eventually, I tell you what happened is my great-grandmother on my, I think it would have been my grandfather's mother, who lived with them, was pretty deaf and used to, as I understand it, sit in the corner knitting and praying a lot. She used to pray like mad for her granddaughter to, find the right husband. And she also used to pray for this poor chap, Brian, who comes up from London from time to time and really should have a wife by now because, he's in his 50s. And it was her that put the two of them together. Extraordinarily. I mean, you talk about going back generations, that's a long way back. And she said, I think this might be God. So
you've got Jimmy.
Amazing.
You've got Jimmy, and now we've got this intervention.
Exactly. And she sort of gave the green light. And as I understand it, my dad's asking they don't know that they necessarily particularly dated. My dad sort of went for a walk on a cliff top somewhere with my mum and said to her, would you consider marrying me? But if you do, you need to know we might never have children and you'll be widowed. Hell of a proposal. And my mum said, okay. So I'm pretty glad they got together. So they were different backgrounds, different generations, different countries. And I think, but a lot in common. I don't want to overstate it. Prayerful. Earliest memories would be, them sitting in bed praying, reading their Bible every morning. You'd hear the sound of that through the wall. We'd often kneel down at the sofa at night before bed and pray together. I felt a strong connection with their own spiritual histories.
Yeah, I know you've written about early memories of seeing your father kneeling by the side of the bed and praying.
Yeah.
So, have you read Gilead or come across the book Gilead by Marilyn Robinson?
Yeah, stunning,
okay.
Stunning. In fact, you can spot
the immediate. I'm just thinking, gosh, this sounds.
There's a quote. There's a quote from Gilead.
Yeah.
That I have this sort of secret file that I've told my boys. Look, if I ever get knocked over by a bus, you need to dig this out. And there's a quote from Gilead. I've said, you could use that in my funeral if you'd like. Back to my awareness of death thing.
Yeah. Sorry, for anyone listening to this, Gilead by Marilyn Robinson is an epistolary novel where the main character in the book is writing notes to his son because he's far, far older than his wife and knows that he won't be around to see his son grow up.
And he's a pastor.
And he's a Presbyterian, isn't he, as well? I think he was. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Pete. I mean, you've already touched on some other family, friends, and in particular people that were praying for you. Any other relatives or family parents, godparents that come to mind that were formative for you? And
I think I've talked about this elsewhere, but I had one of my dad's friends, Michael Curry, lovely guy, struggled with depression, and was my godfather, and prayed for me every single day of his life and my life, therefore, from as I was born, until the day that he tragically died in a climbing accident on the Isle of Skye. And I'm not quite processed. I don't know if I fully understand it, Jason, but I'd gone to the Isle of Skye to propose to my girlfriend. knew that my godfather, who grew up very near you in Cheam, knew that my godfather was also on the Isle of Skye at the same time on holiday. And sort of it crossed my mind, should I go and try and see Uncle Michael? And to be honest, he was a further drive away there than he was when I was back down south. So I didn't bother. The day I was going to propose to Sammy, I was climbing in the Kulin mountain range and nearly died, but obviously didn't. And therefore delayed proposing by 24 hours because we were all pretty traumatized. That day, Uncle Michael was climbing in the same mountain range, fell and died. And I don't think that can be coincidence, but I'm not sure I believe in a God who micromanages. I think it might just be a sort of symmetry thing. But anyway, I know that I owe Uncle Michael more than I can put into words, and that, you know, if one or two people look at me and say, oh, you know, you're doing some good things with your life for Jesus, I suspect that I've not given God a very good return on simply even just the investment of my Uncle Michael's prayers for me over. I think a lot of people, if they'd had that level of prayer every day of their lives until adulthood, would be doing much more remarkable things than me with that investment.
Can I be cheeky and say, what do you think Michael would be saying to you about your life as a result of his prayers? Would he have the same assessment of you as you do of yourself?
No, I think he'd be encouraging. But what I find interesting about people like him is, and my mum's actually a bit like this, she's not really at all interested in the big stuff, but terribly interested in the details of character and of, you know, I had this morning, I was on the phone to my mum. You know, if I say to her, you know, I'm speaking to 5,000 people, it'll be a bit sort of, oh, that's nice, dear. But if I tell her, as I did this morning, I just had to go and see someone whose wife just dropped dead, she'll be all over that. And I think there's something pretty healthy in that. So Michael would be like that. He would be interested in the measure to which I am behaving like Jesus and touching the lives of individuals. He wouldn't, you know, 24/7, you know, church planning strategies. I don't think he'd be that interested. Conferences. Yeah.
It's interesting because it would be so easy to gloss over your self-assessment there as just an act of self-deprecation in the face of international things that you do. But I get the sense that you actually really meant what you said about yourself, and I don't mean in a you know, in a way that was derisory of yourself, but what's underneath that assessment of yourself that, you know, despite everything that you've done, it might not be that great?
I think as the years, someone who mentored me, an old RE teacher of mine, who's still, you know, I meet up with and I respect a great deal. He's quite elderly now, Mike Fox. I remember he said to me years ago, the experience of Christians over the years, as they get closer to Jesus, they actually become more aware of their faults and failings, not less. It's as though standing close to the light exposes more. And that shocked me because I think I just thought, well, it's sort of conveyor belt and you just become more and more and more like Jesus. Maybe you do, but I don't think it's very healthy if you think that you do. And I definitely, you know, I'm more aware of my weakness and my failures and my inadequacy now than I would have been, you know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And that, I'm not just saying that, I really feel that. And I have to work at receiving grace as a result. I think there's something. I think there's something godly in that, actually, that I welcome. But there's also something that's a shadow that I need to just be a bit careful of as well. That could be a little, unhealthily self-dismissing.
Thank you for letting me lean into that with you. So let's talk a bit more about where you grew up. Talked about it a little bit, but any other ways in which your childhood was, I've got down here, either you had a sense of privilege or being deprived? Anything else that comes to mind?
Yeah, no, I definitely felt both of those things. Yeah, I mean, the brutalizing effect of being sent away to a boarding school at the age of 11 and hating it, and being in a very dark place where, the chaplain was taking people for seances, and people were seeing ghosts, spirits in our dormitory of 30, and as one time a light moved down the dormitory, and as it passed, every single boy sat up in their bed and felt the terror as it moved down this long dormitory. And I was supposed to be the Christian, and I was supposed to understand what this was. So I went to see the housemaster, and of course he didn't take it seriously. And boys were attempting suicide, and there was masses of sexual predatorship amongst the boys, and it was just a really brutal place. And I felt deeply abandoned after this very safe childhood by my parents. And my older brother stuck it out, and it damaged him deeply, but he stayed to the end and was a success outwardly, but inwardly would still say, now as a middle-aged man, a respectable lawyer in Oxford, I'm still having to process the wounds of that. I'm a natural rebel. Maybe it's a middle child thing. And I ultimately, after 3 years, said, I'm just not having this. And I ran away and got picked up by the police, and sort of forced my parents to move me to a different school. And I'm so grateful, because, and I think probably partly my brother slightly resents me. I mean, we've got a good relationship now, but resents me for it because he stuck it out, and here I am not being submissive and not doing the right thing, and I sort of get away with it.
Yeah. So how did you process that with your parents? I mean, were they sympathetic, understanding? I mean, what was that like for you in that moment? So you rebel, you run away, but underneath it is this horrible experience.
I borrowed my friend Peter Banks's big old Parker coat. Do you remember the Parker coats with the big hood that came up?
The one you could do up, and then it would give you the...
Very much so, Jason. And
I'd
filled the pockets with everything that a 14-year-old boy thinks you're going to need if you run away from home. So, I had biscuits and Swiss Army knife and a ball of string for no apparent reason. And I looked like a womble, because my pockets were so full. And I made a break for it. I put pillows into my bed, and to make it look like I was sleeping, and I got out, and I was walking down the dual carriageway and saw the blue flashing light, and the police car came and picked me up and took me to the police station in Dorking. And it was the funniest thing, because I'm sure it's different now, but back then they had to write down everything they took off me and record it in triplicate. And it sort of went 1 ball restraint, 1 ball restraint, 1 penknife, 1 penknife, 1 block of Sainsbury's jelly, orange. It was the funniest thing. Then they phoned my dad. They assumed I'd nicked something or done something terrible. That's why I was running away. They phoned my dad and woke him in the middle of the night with the line, Mr. Greig, we've got your son. It's a Dorking police station. We've got your son. which can't have been a great moment for him. And all I remember was feeling ashamed, and he came and simply said, "Oh, Pete," and threw his arms around me, and then took me home, and my mum was awake waiting and did the same. So they really showed me love. I think I went through a breakdown. We wouldn't have used that language back then, but for about a year, 9 months before then, it's the strangest thing, but I kept apologizing for everything. You know, if you stood on my toe, I would apologize. It was bizarre behavior. I think I was sort of imploding. So they moved me to another school, and I'm not sure we ever fully processed it. There are times we've tried to talk about it, and I feel quite angry that there's a part of me that, why did you do that? I wouldn't dream of doing that to one of my kids. But the truth is, my dad thought it was the right thing to do because of his cultural background. It was a boarding school that you could go to for free, and he couldn't really afford, because he just didn't charge people. He didn't make any money, so he could afford it, and he felt self-conscious that he was getting old and he wasn't any fun. So he thought, well, you can go off and play rugby and have fun. And my mum, I don't think she ever really thought we should go to boarding school, but she sort of submitted. So yeah, I don't know if we ever fully. We never sat down and said, right, let's talk about this. We didn't really do that.
Yeah. And if I can lean in a little, use that phrase again. I don't want to overlay my context on yours too much, but just to get to a question for you. You know, I mean, I suffered horrendous abuse when I was a kid, and my nan was a spiritualist and stuff. And there's all those things that, you know, like you at my age, I'm still coming to terms with. It's amazing what you still, like you say, it's who you are that God's more interested in what you've done. And we've both reached that age where you probably realize how those things carry with you in your body and mind and spirit.
Yeah.
But I found there's another side. There is and this will get me to my question for you. I have a spiritual sensitivity as a Christian to atmospheres and environments and people.
Interesting.
So I had to have that dialing in. I could sense things when I was a kid, and I was just listening to you in that environment. Is there anything about your, I guess we would say discernment, isn't it? But you know what I mean in shorthand for atmospheres and people and environments, and just thinking of the prayer world that you're in and spiritual battles and everything else. Do you think it left you with an attunement to things?
I don't think I'm very spiritually sensitive. I suspect, you know, you and I have run into each other from time to time, haven't we, over the years? I suspect you're more spiritually sensitive than me. I think I've probably got pretty high EQ, and that may well be in part to do with the dynamics of learning to read rooms. And I mean, they say that people who grow up with alcoholic parents, right, are, you know, incredible at discerning what's going on in the room, because they continually from childhood were second guessing, you know, the moods as it changed in the room. Maybe that's part of where that sort of EQs come from, but so I'm fairly good at working out what's going on in people, but I'm pretty thick when it comes to spiritual presences in the room. I don't doubt that stuff for a second. I have friends who are very discerning, and I will often say, what are you seeing? What are you sensing? But I'm pretty thick when it comes to that stuff.
So moving on. As someone who's talked about taking the boring Thursday evening prayer meeting and turn it into a tabernacle experience, that you seem to have practiced at home in a garden shed, as we're doing our research for today. Could we unpack the garden shed? What's about that?
Yeah. In the back garden there in Reigate, we had it was a lot, you know, it was a bit more than a shed. It was a sort of shack playroom, big chest freezer in the corner, and When I moved to schools, this wonderful RE teacher, Mike Fox, used to open his home. I don't know if teachers would be allowed to do it, but he had a house that was right on the boundary of my new school, Reigate Grammar School. And he used to open it for people to come and have their lunches there. And I used to go down. He ran a Christian union and just encouraged us and was wonderfully sort of laid back and really gave me a sort of footing for my faith that meant that I decided to give God a proper go. And I think because of my sort of the way I'm wired, it was sort of, well, if this stuff's true, it's really got to be true. I think part of my reaction against the whole Reigate thing, and I felt, having grown up St Mary's Reigate, and it's funny, if you go to boarding school, you don't actually make friends in your own town, so you don't quite know where you belong. But I used to go along and feel like an outsider at this sort of evangelical Anglican church, where it felt like everyone was basically posh, drove, Volvo estates. The image in my head was, it was smiling parents, smiling kids, and a smiling Labrador, and then this is what they did for church. It didn't feel very real. It didn't, and it didn't seem to relate to the questions I was actually asking about being bullied and broken, and why did I apologize 100 times a day, or lust, or so it was that, and I just thought, look, I can't, if being a Christian is just smiling for the rest of my life and pretending everything's fine, I'm just not interested. But if it could be riots and revival, which is what I read about in the book of Acts, let's do this. And so I just started to gather a few of my friends and say, let's try and make God turn up in the shed in my mum's back garden on a Wednesday night. And we had no clue what we were doing. We didn't know anything about the Holy Spirit, really. In fact, when these meetings started to really take off, the vicar called me into his study and told me in no uncertain terms to stop, which was the most exciting thing that happened to me in church for a long time. Obviously, I mean, suddenly you can be it's a punk rock sensibility. It's like, great, I've got a cause. I'd always wanted to stick it to the man. I just didn't know who the man was. And so we did dreadful things, Jason. It's appalling, to try and make God turn up. We sort of sang bad songs, and we had communion and tried to look meaningfully in each other's eyes. And we read poems by a Catholic priest called Michel Coist, who had released this book one of us had picked up that was sort of about faith, and God in his grace came. I mean, that's the funny thing, to a shed. And word got out, and people started to want to be in this shed in my mum's back garden. And a guy called Steve Quashie turned up and started to have pictures and visions. We'd never experienced anything like that before. And started to tell us about the Holy Spirit. And then my friend, I think it was Shawla, who was head girl, she said, I've heard this thing about being filled with the Holy Spirit. Can you pray for it to happen to me? And she sat there on this white wooden bench, and Steve and I prayed for her, and she started shaking violently. I mean, that doesn't happen in Reigate. I didn't think it was happening anywhere else in the world as it happens. I'd never heard of it before. Anyone who says auto-suggestion, no one could have been more shocked than me. What on earth's going on? She looked like she was being electrocuted in a bouncy castle. And then I had this horrible thought of maybe she'll do this for the rest of her life now. Like we found out how to switch it on, but we don't know how to switch it off. So we couldn't stop it. but she was just shaking, and we ran out of things to pray pretty quickly. So we went to the chest freeze and got chalk ices, and we sat and ate chalk ices and just watched her shaking. We didn't know what else to do. And then eventually she stopped and said she felt closer to Jesus than ever before. We said, that's good, you know. And it was quite exciting. My friend Mark Forden, who, you know, he basically started coming along because there was a girl called Becky who everyone fancied. And he just, we were sort of worshipping one night. And by this stage, we were beginning to learn how to worship. And there was that sense of the presence of God. I mean, I sort of joke about it now, but it was wonderful, actually. And Mark just ran out and sat on the concrete step outside. So I went out and sat with him and said, are you all right? And he said, no, God was in there. And I said, where two or three are gathered. And he nearly hit me. He said, don't quote any expletive Bible verse at me. I'm trying to tell you that the creator of the universe is in that shed. And if I go back in there, there's some things I'm going to have to get right in my life. I don't really want to do that right now. He never went back in. And, you know, it was an exciting time. And I have reflected subsequently that there's this weird thing, and maybe it goes back to John and George Govan praying all night in Edinburgh, and you know, the room shaking, and some part of my memory that's before my time, I don't know, but this sort of gathering people to seek God in a particular place has become one of the key grace notes of my life.
Wow. So how old are you at that when this is all happening, Pete?
Well, that was sort of 17 around then, and you know, it's sort of early A levels and all of that, Jason. Yeah. And then everything went wrong.
Right.
And I quit my faith. So, you know, don't be too impressed.
Yeah, I was then going to say, how did you get from that then to trying to be, I mean, you say you're a pretty bad atheist, but what happened?
Well, yeah, I mean, this has probably been relatively well documented, not by anyone else, no one else is interested, but by me, you know, after school, there was a perfect storm. So my friend Steve Quashie, who I've just mentioned, and I were going to do schools work. This was really exciting. We were getting invitations, but it's basically a school. Steve was black and cool and could play guitar. I was a lanky, slightly over earnest, you know, white guy from Surrey. But then someone committed suicide, and it was tragic. And Steve suddenly had to bail out and left the area, and I knew I couldn't do the schools thing without him. And so I didn't know what to do with my life, and I ended up getting a job cleaning toilets in the New East Surrey Hospital, which, if you're going to be a toilet cleaner, I'm going to make a case that it's probably the worst kind of toilets to clean. I doubled up as a T-boy, which again, I've always thought is a pretty rough combination. And I would come home from shifts just massively depressed. My girlfriend had just chucked me, which it's not cool to admit really, but it had broken my heart. My first proper girlfriend. And I'd not done particularly well on my A levels, and I'd failed my driving test, and I was lonely because most of my friends had gone off to university, and I felt God had let me down. And I would come home and go to bed each night, not at night, like whatever time it was, and just sleep and eat, and I'd get up and go to the next shift. So I now realize I was depressed, but I don't think I knew how to frame it like that at the time. And I'd gone from this sort of spiritual high to, you know, to being kind of the guy in that little scene to suddenly being very lonely and feeling very abandoned by God. And that was the beginning of a process. And God just seemed to disappear completely. And it came to a head one night in St. Mary's Church, Reigate. Everyone starting to sing the hymn, and I just felt this whole thing is tosh. It's just nonsense. It's just not true. And I ran out of the church and I ran back home screaming at God and weeping and saying, I don't believe you exist. I just don't believe you exist. And then asking myself, who do you think you're telling? And lapsed into this season of, I remember waking up the next morning going, I'm not a Christian anymore. Hooray, I can do anything I want. And then realizing I didn't really want to go and do that stuff I'd always fantasized I would do if I wasn't a Christian. The trouble is I'd actually thought about it and knew that just, even if the offers were there, just sort of mindlessly shagging people, but it wasn't really actually what I was about. So I continually found myself talking to God about his non-existence. And so I realized depressingly I was even worse at being an atheist than at being a Christian. It was I felt completely trapped. So I lapsed into beige agnosticism. And then God really, eventually, but he takes his time, eventually, a few months later, really quite remarkably broke back into my life. And change, and that I sometimes actually frame that as the moment of conversion, funnily enough. Although, of course, I'd been trying to follow Jesus right the way through boarding school and seeking God in my mother's shed and everything else. But I think definitely that was when I really said, okay, this is me for life.
All right, Pete, we're going to segue now into the next part of your life, and just a couple of paragraphs here just to set the scene. So looking at your CV, our researcher Simon found that you've been involved in so many episodes or contemporary adventures of the UK and worldwide church that it becomes a bit dizzying for us. You've described yourself as a bewildered founder of the 24/7 prayer movement. And so what we want to do now is cover your globe-trotting from the cliffs of St. Vincent in the Algarve to Hong Kong, to Chichester, to the Outer Hebrides, Herrnhut, Prague, Ibiza, Vienna, the United States, the flesh pots of Holy Trinity Brompton, South Kensington, and anywhere else that you get to mention. Now, Simon, our researcher, claims to have a doctorate in English literature. He does, a PhD, but in reality, he spent 7 years reading comic books, otherwise known as ripping yarns, or larger than life boys' own adventure stories. And in reading your books, and Simon's a very thorough researcher, he's made a connection between his project and your life, and he was struck by how similar your life has been in what would be called a classic yarn. In fact, he wondered if you had decided to deliberately use the adventure genre to give some shape to your story. I suspect you're going to tell me that most of your life has happened by accident from the sounds of it. But to unpack that a bit, we could use Narnia or The Lord of the Rings, but let's settle for Harry Potter, which is a sort of quest narrative in which destiny taps the hero on the shoulder and draws them from a comfortable existence into a predetermined quest that they didn't really understand and are not sure that they want, and get taken along for the ride. And your life certainly seems to have been filled with outrageous incidents, massive coincidences on the face of it. So we're just gonna use that as a gentle idea that I wouldn't say destiny, but salvation, history, and God taps you on the shoulder as the theme for the rest of the interview. So coming back to the point where you've all that stuff and despondency, finishing your A levels and stuff. What did you do then? What happened? You finish your A levels. What happens next?
I ended up through an extraordinary set of circumstances in Hong Kong, working with a remarkable lady many people have heard of called Jackie Pullinger. And, God had spoken to me through a Christmas card this is December 1987, on which Isaiah 58 was printed. Your light will shine when you spend yourself on behalf of the poor and satisfy the needs of the oppressed. And that was the passage that was printed at the top of Jackie Pullinger's headed paper at the time. And I met a lady in Sheffield who's a friend of hers called Nicole, who said, you need to get the next plane to Hong Kong. So, I went home and told my dear old dad, I'm getting the next plane to Hong Kong. And I'm also, I'm such a sort of, I'm not very consistent really, because, on one hand, I'd recently been renouncing my faith, but the moment this happened, I announced to all my friends I was going to go and find out how to do miracles and come back and start revival. So, go figure. But I got to Hong Kong, and what I discovered was that I was surrounded by people far more like Jesus than me. I mean, the miracles were happening. You don't forget it when you talk to someone who says, I was blind and now I can see, and they're staring you in the eyes. But, and I prayed with people coming off heroin, and it was tough. I was punched in the face. I mean, when triad gang members have a kid from Surrey telling them to sweep the floor, they don't like it very much. So, and there were hilarious moments, like one of the brothers, I was stationed eventually out to an island called Dio, which is a little fishing community on stilts, just off on Lantau Island, just off Hong Kong. And beautiful, next to a Buddhist temple. And one of the brothers escaped, but he was in his pajamas, and I ended up following him in his pajamas all through Hong Kong. I mean, it was the strangest thing. It was like something out of Tintin. But I was surrounded by people more like Jesus than me, and I started to become embarrassed to be me. Embarrassed by the things I thought, this just pure selfishness and self-obsession, and the dirty things I found funny. I just became embarrassed by myself. And it's funny, where do you go with that? Like, you don't go, if you're physically sick, you go to a doctor. If you're mentally sick, you go to see a psychiatrist. Where do you go when you're embarrassed to be yourself? And that pushed me to prayer, pushed me to God. So I didn't really understand. I don't think this was the work of the Holy Spirit, but I had one day off a week, and I'd go back to Kowloon, and I would stay overnight in a little room in a tin hut on a former, I think it was army base that Jackie Pullinger had at the time in Kowloon, called Hang Fu Camp. And I would spend the day, in my one day off in the week, in this tin hut, praying repeatedly, thousands and thousands of times, as if I was going crazy. Maybe I was going crazy. The same mantra: change my heart or take me home. Change my heart or take me home. Change my heart or take me home. I didn't want to be on planet Earth any longer with the heart that I had. And I didn't experience anything or feel that anything happened. But when eventually I was called by God to return to England, it's funny to have to go to Hong Kong to be called to England. God had changed me. I mean, I'm still a mess, but to the extent that my physical appearance had changed. And I can measure that because there was one particular family friend who had known me all my life, who failed to recognize me at first. And I just think God had done something in me at every level, outwardly, inwardly, and had heard those prayers and had begun a process of changing me. So the miracle was not that I learned how to do miracles. The miracle was God maybe just began to transform me a bit. So when I came back to the UK, I didn't have a clue what to do. The natural rebel in me had sort of said, I'm not just going to do university. In my world, that's what was expected of you. You weren't really allowed to think for yourself until you'd finished university. It was a conveyor belt. And so I was just not wanting to do that. But when God clearly told me to go, I didn't know what to do. And it was at the time, you'll remember this, Jason, where wonderfully and amazingly the government would pay for you to go to university. Hallelujah. And so I started phoning around. This was probably July. Any university would have me for any course that they, I fancied media studies, but those courses were all full. And eventually I saw a course, theology and sociology at the University of Greenwich, as it is now. Phoned them up. I think it was, I'd seen it in the Guardian, and they offered me a place, and I said okay. And they said, well, don't you want to come and see the campus? I said, no, not really. So I just turned up, and that was the next 3 years of my life, and it was a great time, and I valued it. I appreciated it a lot. It was good fun living in southeast London. Yeah.
Well, that's where we've got something in common, that we both went to Thames Polytechnic.
Exactly. Did you hear I said, as it's called now?
Now,
so where were you? Where were you?
Well, this is what I didn't realise until Simon did the research for today. I did a PGCE, and I went there
Avery Hill
1991. So you and I were both students at Thames Poly, as it was, at the same time.
No.
Yeah.
What campus were you on?
I was over. I did RE over at the. It was right. I don't even remember. It was so long ago.
Well, Jason, it would either have been Woolwich, or it would have been Avery Hill and Eltham.
Avery Hill, Eltham. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I was at Avery Hill for my first year, and then I lived in Blackfen, just near Sidcup, on the crossroads there. And then I moved into live in Plumstead, and my bit of the course moved to Woolwich, which is actually great fun. It's a great fun place to live. Proper sort of East End London back then, because everyone was displaced, weren't they, out of the East End out that way. And we lived in a great big old mansion, about 12 students, beautiful old vicarage in Plumstead, surrounded by a very rough housing estate. So the owner of this house, that would have been worth millions, it wasn't worth anything, because no one who wanted a house like that wanted to live on an estate like that. So the 12 students, and we threw the best parties. We would have Bob Dylan, out onto the lawn. We'd have drum and bass, in the hallway. It was rough. We had our TV nicked one day whilst we were watching it. We were burgled repeatedly, actually, and it was a great fun time. Isn't that amazing? So we were there at the same time. I wonder if we ever met.
Well, no, I doubt it. I was living in southwest London in Rains Park, newly married.
Oh, okay.
I would travel over to
just commuting in
to Avery Hill, and then I would do my school placements. It was just for a year when I did a PGCE as an RE.
So did you ever go to the student bar?
No, never.
Yeah.
Not knowingly. And there were all the I do remember all the sports, the people that were doing sport. Yeah. There was the pecking
Avery Hill's big sports, yeah.
And they were just like the gods. They wandered around with their six-packs and tracksuits, and thought everybody else was rubbish. And Eltham, of course, when I went there, I think the Evening Standard voted it London's most boring place to live.
Dartford, Sidcup, Eltham, it is. But of course, Stephen Lawrence was just about to happen. And I used to get the 51 bus in from Blackfen into Woolwich in my second year, and I'd go past the offices of the BNP. That was the hub. It wasn't just so. It kind of, I agree. It's pretty boring, and of course the tube doesn't go out that way.
No,
but
so I basically I
but
didn't live there. I just,
yeah, but the social discontent. I mean, what was actually stirring was pretty historic at that time.
A2 there. So yeah, it was funny, small world. I was looking on I was like, good grief, we were both, and I liked it was listed as the University of Greenwich. It's always nicer to call it that now.
Well, I have a dilemma because Thames Valley just doesn't exist anymore. But there's a slight part of me that feels it's a bit pretentious to say University of Greenwich, but that's what it now is. So I do have, but as you noticed, I
On
said
my
to you,
CV or anybody asked me, I was listed University of Greenwich.
it sounds better, doesn't it?
I do pause when I'm typing it, like, okay, that's what it is. So
For me, it was a principle back then. I remember saying to my mum, I don't want to go, I want to go to poly, not a uni.
yeah,
It was all that reacting to Reigate thing.
yeah, there you go. Interesting. Now, I just want to take a little lean back into Jackie Pullinger Hong Kong. Obviously, you must have encountered it. And I was just listening to you talking about your experience. So you've got this, you're a rubbish atheist who is off to discover how to do revival, and you're in this place, and it sounded like, listening to you, that it was all external. You were watching miracles, you were seeing them, and then you go off to this prayer room, and you're saying, God, what the prayer that you prayed regularly, change my heart, or send me. Will you send me home?
Send me home, yeah.
Send me home. And what it felt like, I could just picture you, this everything external, but by the time you get on a plane and go home, it's become internal to you. Was that what was going on? Were you just watching everything like an observer? When did it get in here? Was it by the time you got, did you not even know? Was it just a moment when what you were was something different?
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting way of framing it. I think it was pretty internal as well. There was no one to pretend to. I do look back and think that was pretty weird what you were doing. There's a strange subtext to the whole thing, which I may not have shared before, but it is that when I told my father I'm getting this plane to Hong Kong, we were sitting at the kitchen table in Reigate, and he broke down and cried. It's, I think, the only time in my life I saw my father cry. And I said to him, why are you crying? And he said the strangest thing. He said, I don't think I'm going to be alive when you come home. What do you do with that? And I got on the plane, and actually I remember thinking, maybe this is what Jesus means when he says, unless you're willing to hate your parents. There's something hateful about just saying, well, I'm going anyway. Well, one night on night duty, you have a lot of time to think and process, and maybe this touches on your question about the external versus the internal, getting in touch with myself.
And I'm realizing I've got a question later on. You talk about being an external processor, and I could just see this.
Yeah.
When did it go? What did it get to go from external to?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I'm processing it probably with you now. I think I wrote my father a letter on blue airmail paper. You had to fit it all on this sort of origami and post it. Basically telling him, you have been a good dad, and I don't regret you being old. And saying to him, because he often, whenever I did anything bad, and out of me and my two brothers, I was definitely the one who did things that were bad. He would often say, "Oh, you're so much like me," as a way of telling me off. And I said in this letter, the thing is, those were some of my proudest moments, you know, because every kid wants to be like their dad, right? So I told him all this stuff and I don't know if I'd quite managed to ever tell him I loved him. He was proper. We didn't very rarely hugged. You know, when I ran away from school, it would have been one of the times. He never told me he was proud of me, except once he told it to someone else and I overheard it, because he felt that would puff me up. You know, it was that old school sort of thing. But I said to him this: I love you, and you know, I later found out. My mum told me that when he received that letter and read it, because he was in constant pain from duodenal ulcers, his pain stopped. For several days, it might even been several weeks, but certainly several days, just miraculously stopped. And when I came back from Hong Kong, he was alive. And we had a depth of relationship we'd never had before. I think because of this communication. The following years, the end of my first year at Thames Poly, as I can now call it to you, I went back to Hong Kong. My dad said bye. I said bye. And he died whilst I was there. And it was as if he'd had a premonition, but just 1 year out. But I'm so grateful to God because we had this year of restored relationship.
Amazing. Amazing.
Yeah. So
last question on Hong Kong, and talk about Jackie Pullinger and talk about the apostolic. Because I just, you know, it's like, where did prayer get birthed in you? Where did something get put into you? So you're in this environment. You got Jackie Pullinger. I've been there 3 times.
Have you?
Short visits, and met with Jackie, and I've taken some of my leadership doctoral students, and it just blows their mind, you know. I mean, just and it's always a highlight. And I told you about the old Japanese guy that I met 104, and who had survived concentration camps and planted thousands. You know, one of those people that has just done so much, you just think you'll never do anything significant in your life. And I told you, I felt the weight of something when he prayed for me, just like a buckling. Now, I remember Jackie Pullinger. I remember thinking it would be very hard to be here. Either you be all into Jesus or not. There's no grey in this place, and it was inspiring. But the second time I was there, and then she, you know what she's like. She walked up, hadn't given me the time of day most of the time, and then she just walked up, looked me in the eyes, and she said, "Jason, God loves you," and put her hand out on me and said, "I bless you in the name of Jesus." I have never felt, in all the times I've been prayed for, I felt many things, but it was like something from the Matrix. It was like it was like everything around me just went, you know, another dimension for a second. And I'm not making anything of Jackie, but it's thinking about the apostolic, how God puts a bit of something of eternity in the kingdom upon people that it's dangerous to get around. I think that's what I felt. I felt the danger. It's like, oh. And it's got me wondering, you know, because when people say, you know, you have the discussions on the apostolic and is it blah, blah, blah. But in some sense, I've always described, I thought Steve Chalk is quite apostolic. You are, and you probably you wouldn't take that term yourself. I've never seen you use it. But in the best sense of what it is, do you think something happened about prayer and you received something there that you brought back with you? You say people looked at you and you were different. You know, did you have any sense that you were carrying anything with you from that time with Jackie? Does that question even make sense?
Yeah, I think I don't know if it was to do with prayer, Jason. I think the prayer thing has always been a byproduct of me of a certain dissatisfaction, a longing for more. And prayer is just kind of like the smoke after the flame, you know. But I think I know that God changed me in that time in Hong Kong. It was the first time I felt I'd done anything interesting with my life, really, other than maybe run away from school. And I think I probably walked a little taller when I came home. I had a story to tell. I'd been somewhere. I'd seen some things, and I turned up at uni, I think probably feeling like a leader. I didn't really know quite what that meant. You know, Jackie, a bit like you, she is exceptional. She, you know, it's amazing to interface these sorts of people, actually. You know, when we had Jackie come and speak at Emmaus a year or two ago, we still are friends, and she's the only person we've ever had come and speak who is properly famous, really. I mean, we've had the Archbishop of Canterbury, right? He's sort of famous, but she is studied in our re-lessons at school. I mean, that's another level. So we had you know, non-Christian teachers turn up because Jackie Punch in town. She's amazing. So I remember standing on the edge of a baptistry at Hangfoot Camp. We're baptizing someone, and going through that thing. I was just sort of learning how to have pictures and prophesy. And I had some picture in my head. I did, probably fairly inane. And I was going through that thing of, is it God? Is it just me? And what happens if it's God and I don't say it? What happens if it's not God and I do say it? Oh, that's going on in my head as this guy is getting baptized. And I felt this hand jab me in the back, actually almost knocked me into the water. And it was Jackie. She just said, say it. And I sort of blurted out this thing. And you know, she's one of a kind. So I'm not sure that's where the prayer thing in any specific sense came from, but I think I did come back from Hong Kong feeling that my life might be of interest and that perhaps I could be a leader.
And what was Jesus for you at this point? You know, like you've made clear and you've repeated, you know, I mean, you know, you obviously weren't called enough to be a worship leader. So you talked about you did try to do with prayer what people have done with worship. And I mean, in the best sense, but it's about Jesus. Prayer happens to be, like you said, it's part, but it's actually Jesus front and center for you that you're obsessed with. Where when you got off that plane and got back to England, what place were you at with Jesus?
Well, I think I was in a place of just unbelievably aware of the radicality of Jesus, his heart for the poor. I mean, more than the prayer thing, it was a liberation ethic, I think, that I really captured from Jackie. There's no question that the gospel had to be outworked amongst the marginalized, the broken, the poor, and that God was biased towards those people. To me, that was sort of obvious, and I you know, went on to study that and think about that and read into that and learn about it. But it was just something you took in with the water there. And I think the radicality of Jesus too, that suddenly things began to converge. You know, my vicar had told me to stop gathering to seek Jesus in the shed, and he was just wrong. And he was somehow trying to control. He was somehow kind of afraid of the wildness of what might happen, the uncontrolledness. Ironically, he was the vicar who sent Jackie Pullinger to Hong Kong. That's another story. And I think the wildness of John 3, you know, those born of the Spirit are unpredictable like the wind. The sense that Jesus does take you on great adventures. It was very, very real to me. And it did seem to me that following him was the greatest adventure. And so I was unable to frame going to Thames Poly as, well, this is just what you do. I was going because the government was paying for me to go on a 3-year mission to transform lives. That was the sort of confidence, I think, and vision that had been bestowed upon me.
Amazing. Do you know, you remind, I need to see if I can get Jackie Pullinger to Sutton. I didn't know till recently she's from Sutton, my hometown.
Yes, she is.
And I've suddenly got this amazing, I've been to Hong Kong 3 times. We've got 1,500 Hong Kong families moving into where I live, and amazing mission and just amazing opportunity here. And I'm like, oh, Hong Kong's
let's get her over together. Let's do something together.
Sutton. It's just off the, that'll be awesome.
My sister lives just down the road.
Oh, does she? Oh, brilliant. So let's move on to Red Moon Rising. You describe a mystical experience or premonition you had whilst on your camping holiday in the Algarve. I know for some people that have heard this story a lot, and it's very redolent of quest narratives, what's known in the literary trade as an inciting incident, and this certainly seemed to be it. You know, without this moment, I mean, when I've heard the story, it's like without this moment that we wouldn't have 24/7, would we? So could you for, again, a lot of people listening to this might not be familiar with that. Could you unpack that moment for us, Pete?
Yeah, I'd in my final year at uni, I'd had my heart broken again by another girl, and I'd really found great healing moving into the big old mansion I described earlier, and sharing a room with a wonderful guy called Nick Pomfrey, and I think he was just, we just went out to a lot of live music and smoked rollies and threw good parties, and I loved the Lord, but I think it was just learning to live. And then he and I decided to hitchhike around Europe together. This was not a spiritual pilgrimage. We were just having fun. And I remember I think we just picked up a cheap flight to Malaga. It was the cheapest we get from a travel agent in Victoria, and arrived there. And we hitchhiked along. Oh no, we started in Seville. Yeah, that's right. And then we hitchhiked along the south coast of Portugal there, the Algarve, and it was the most wonderful time. I mean, every night we were camped on a cliff top with an open fire, cooking fresh fish that we'd got in a market that day, and drinking the cheapest red wine imaginable. And then we'd wake up in the morning and we'd go down to the next beach and we'd swim and lie around, and we just kept traveling with the sea on our left hand side, heading west for a few weeks, and very tanned, very dirty, very long hair. And then this rather magical moment where the sea appeared on the right hand side as well, and the land began to narrow, and we were at Cape St. Vincent, the most southwesterly point in Europe, which the Romans thought was the end of the world. Beyond there be dragons, and it is pretty wild. It's very rugged, and we put our little tent up and sort of found it satisfying that we were the most southwesterly people in Europe that night. And in the middle of the night, I couldn't sleep. I woke, came out of the tent, and because there's no light pollution, the stars, I think I wrote somewhere, it's like being lost in the branches of a Christmas tree. Just the stars were everywhere. And I prayed. And I remember raising my hands facing south, so it was towards the Mediterranean, and imagining Africa and praying for Africa as best I could. And then I turned and faced west, faced the Atlantic, and imagined America, prayed for America. And I turned with my back to the two oceans, and there's the tent, and you see the scrubland just rolling out, and I could visualize, Portugal into Spain, and Spain into France, and Germany, and eventually you into the Middle East and Russia and whatever. And I raised my hands, and as I was praying for Europe, I had this sort of mystical experience, and I didn't talk about it for many years because I think I thought people would think I was mad. But I heard a crackling sound, and my body began to shake, but I didn't think it was God. I thought I was being actually literally electrocuted. So I remember looking up, thinking there must be a wire over my head that's short-circuiting, and of course there wasn't. You don't get those on cliffs. And I saw, my eyes were open, but I saw, and just to be clear, it was like a CGI moment. It was superimposed on the landscape, so I could still see the landscape in front of me, but it was like superimposed upon it, a sort of like the map you would have of Europe in a schoolboy atlas. And I just saw this army of young people just rising up out of the pages of the atlas, and I don't know how long it lasted for. I mean, it's the strangest thing, isn't it? It could have been a minute, but it could have been half an hour. I just don't know. Eventually it ended, and I climbed back into my sleeping bag thinking, what was that? And then we began, so we continued hitching up through Lisbon and back across, eventually back to London. And everywhere I went, I was saying to God, well, what was that? And where is that army I saw? And in many ways, I think that was the defining moment of my life.
Wow. Let's move on to something different. Hormones. A number of young heroes coming to the kingdom of God chasing a girl, and even more striking is how rejection by a woman is a significant catalyzing event. And
Don Quixote.
Yeah, and it's I interviewed Chris Lee, the Instagram priest, and
Chris.
He emerges, interviewing him, he told us about emerging from a spiritual crisis after being rejected in a relationship. And so I mean, you again, yeah, Steve Chalker, it's amazing. Others, the catalyzing, what God does with people at that age around those moments through their relationships to catalyze them and focus them. So could you tell us about where Sammie comes into things for you?
Yeah, my darling wife.
What happens
Yeah, she after uni, I knew for sure by the end of uni that I was called to the church. And that was interesting because, for me that sounded quite exciting, but for a lot of my friends, the last thing they wanted to do was anything to do with the church. So I was offered a job at Red Hill Christian Fellowship to go on staff there, and I would have been the first staff member. And in one way, it would have been really exciting. I had a degree in theology at this point, and I'd done my stuff for Jackie Pullinger, and we'd driven 7.5-ton trucks out to Romania, and done this stuff.
And it's in spitting distance of Reigate.
Yeah, exactly. But
yeah,
I was very troubled that I'd never really received any personal discipleship. I could talk a good game. Jackie Pullinger had sort of nuked my world. But I'd been brokenhearted, and that hit me very, very, very hard. And what was I supposed to do? I mean, in the Anglican Church, still to this day, I would say probably, you sort of wait. You either read a Christian book on the subject, or you wait for it to come up in a sermon series. You know how long that's going to take, and what if you miss that Sunday, or what if it's not a very good talk? And I'd gone to one or two people and said, I had this language, be a father and God to me. That was the language I had. And they all said yes, but none of them knew how to do it. I was desperate to find someone who could actually help me to be a Christian in the real hidden secret areas of my life. And and the effect, it was not just being brokenhearted, it was lust and masturbation and just, I mean, all the real inner world stuff. And I thought, Flip, you can get into this Christian leadership malarkey and never really have resolved any of that stuff. Right? I hardly had more than about one conversation about it. What is that? And I met this guy, Roger Ellis, who impressed me because he was one of the few Christian leaders I'd ever met who looked like he could hold his own in the pub, but was utterly passionate about Jesus. And he said that if I moved down to Chichester, this peculiar place where I was to meet Sammy, he would disciple me. I would write a journal and he would read it. And you know, it was part. I then found out it's part of this internship program. I didn't really understand that at the time. And funnily enough, I was thrilled. I mean, I now look back and think that's weird that I wanted to do that, but I was thrilled. I'd found someone, and I remember going to my first tutorial session with Roger, walking along the A27 to where the office was, so I didn't know the proper way to walk, and holding a scrap of paper on which I'd written my list of worst sins for dear life, thinking, gosh, I mustn't drop this, and pushing it across the desk to Roger as he drank his morning coffee, saying, here you go. And he looked mildly appalled. And so it was the beginning of this process that again would change the direction of my life. And in Chichester on that year, 3 things happened. Firstly, I fell in love with the church. That particular church, something beautiful and wonderful was happening there. Many people from alternative backgrounds getting saved, really exciting stuff. Secondly, I fell in love with the area, which was really strange because when I first turned up, I thought it was dreadful. I'd been living in southeast London, as multicultural as you can be. I couldn't work out, what do people do? This is like a national trust incarnate. Like, other than go to the pub and watch videos, what do you do? Friends used to come down, and I suddenly realized they were black. I hadn't really noticed before until they came to Chichester. And but I fell in love with it. It's very beautiful, you know, the Witterings, and actually some of the pubs are very nice and whatever. And then the third and most important thing was I fell in love with Sammy. She was on the same year as me. She says I walked into the room and she thought, oh dear, here comes trouble. I wasn't used to Christian girls looking, frankly, as hot as she did. She plumbed the depths of shallow. She was quite newly saved at this point, so she didn't really know how Christians were supposed to be. I remember getting to a car being very surprised she had no Christian music, and she didn't even really know what I was talking about. And you know, I remember having a headache. She didn't want someone to pray for her because she said it doesn't really work. I'd rather take an asprin. I just found her so refreshing. Try that at Bethel. And we just inevitably, I think, fell in love. And we didn't date till the end of the year because we weren't supposed to. And we decided to keep that rule. I'm grateful because it forced us to build a friendship, which was going to be very important in what happened later. And, you know, when my dad wrote back to that letter I wrote him on the airmail paper from Hong Kong, he said something there. He said, I pray to God that he will one day give you a wife who knows how to laugh you out of yourself. It's a good prayer for an over-intense, over-earnest young man. And God answered that prayer in Sammy. She didn't spend the rest of her life plumbing the depths of shallow. She has incredible depths, but back then she was pretty shallow, and I was so grateful.
It sounds like another one of these moments listening to you map your life out, you know, but always, so we got all these coincidences, got Jimmy all the way back with your dad.
Yeah.
But here is another moment. You're ready to go to Red Hill, and you're talking about this deep-seated, you know, deep awareness that you need mentoring, fathering. Roger Ellis says, "Yeah, come down here." Again, another one of those. What would have? Again, it's another one. It just sounds like another one of those moments that you had no idea in that moment what it was going to do, change the course of your life and so many other people's. Again, another one. No Sammy, no 24/7.
It seems to me, I mean, step back from God a second, just life. The two great realities we're too terrified to face is that firstly, we're all time bombs waiting to go off. We're mortal. And secondly, that we have an unbelievable power of choice. And that each choice we make creates fractals. It creates, it's like chucking a pebble into it creates, you don't make one decision makes 100 decisions. And we can't live with the sheer implications of the power of choice that we have. And that is why it's so good to believe that there is a God who makes an oak tree grow symmetrically and makes a young Jason Clark accompany his mum along to a church and change. It's so wonderful to believe there's a God who's in charge of those choices that we make and is busy creating beauty out of the chaos.
Yes. Well, talking of beauty, let's go back to Sammy. So you and Sammy then run the youth congregation warehouse. Is that right? Is that you're supposed to be discipling all these young people. So did Roger fast track you? Yeah,
he didn't. I mean, so I at the end of that internship year, I was still meant to go back to Red Hill and take up the role there.
Yep.
I even went back and a guy called Roger Mitchell, pulled me out of the crowd and prophesied over me that
Roger Mitchell. So we've got Roger Ellis. Yeah. Now we've got
Roger Mitchell at Ichthus.
Oh gosh, yeah. So I didn't realise the Roger Mitchell bit. By the way, you've got all these people, Pete. You can see. So you've got Roger Ellis. By the way, I've got a Roger Ellis story. Sorry, I'll just interpose this.
Oh yeah.
I've met Roger twice, Roger Ellis. Second time I met him, didn't remember me at all. But 20 years before, he talked me off a ledge from quitting pastoral ministry.
Wow.
Because a good friend of mine, a guy called Andy Hickford, I went through the most awful thing in our baby church plant, and I was ready to. It was just so conflictual. I was in pieces. I thought I can't cope, and I was going to see him, and he said, "Do you know what? I've got this friend Roger. I think you should have a cup of coffee with him." I had a cup of coffee with Roger Ellis at a service station down near Worthing. And Roger taught me off a cliff. I still have the notes from the advice he gave me 20 years ago, and I was ready to give up on everything. 20 years later, I'm contacting him about Westminster Theological College and stuff. And I go, "Do you remember 20 years ago?" He goes, "No." He doesn't remember talking to me. But,
Roger's a legend. I so love that guy.
So you've got Roger Ellis, and then we've now got Roger.
And Roger Forster as well.
And the other, I didn't ask if the other Roger was involved as well.
Roger Forster kept me sane when I was at uni, because you're studying theology with very few believers amongst my lecturers. It wasn't a Christian course, really. And I was given every argument you could possibly hope to have for giving up my faith. And Roger Forster, I could see he was just as clever as any of my professors, but he was using his intellect to build something, not to pull something down. And ultimately, that was the apologetic that won me over, was that who knows? Who knows? We can't prove one thing, but I would rather live my life constructing than deconstructing. And I still, that the passion of Roger Forster's preaching and it's still very deeply within me, the what he called radical church history, the history of the free church tradition, that that's often been written out or misrepresented by the Episcopal traditions that have, since Constantine sort of determined the story. And Roger Mitchell at Red Hill, but I was meant to go back there. But then I remember talking to Roger Ellis, and he just said, "Well, it really depends how you see the prophetic, Pete, and what's its relationship between that and what you actually want and what you think and common sense." And in the end, I realised I'd rather be a small fish in a big pond, which was how I perceived staying at Reb's in Chichester compared to the other. And so I stayed, and I got a job working with adults with learning disabilities. Literally wiping bottoms and much less, traumatically cooking and enjoying that. And then it was in the midst of that the youth worker at the church had a nervous breakdown. They needed someone urgently, and I quit my job and said, "Okay, I'll do it." And that was the beginning of whatever it's been now, 27, no, I don't know how many, almost 30 years of full-time Christian leadership. So yeah, that was that. And Sammy and I, we started a youth congregation and called Warehouse at that time.
Yeah. Now, you said Roger Mitchell. You said, did he stand you up, have a word for you, or something?
Yeah.
What, you remember what it was? Do you remember
Yeah, it was the fruit of your ministry will be in this geographical location.
Right.
And I basically ignored it.
Wow.
But I've always been open. I probably should be careful because I suddenly get lots of invitations from Red Hill, but I've always thought, well, Lord, there may well still be something for us to do there. I don't know what that is, but
Wow. It's amazing, isn't it? We have. I went to Spring Harvest when I was 17 as a new Christian. Blew me away, and that one of the speakers, Jim Graham, and he had his little book on prayer. And he walked past me as a baby Christian at 17, and he, with his broad Scottish accent, and he said, "I don't normally do this, but I felt God tell me I should pray for you." He said, "I'm not very charismatic." And basically, he prophesied over me at 17 years old about my life and future.
Wow.
It was astonishing.
What did he say?
He basically said I was going to be a leader. I'd be writing things, a thought leader, and some other stuff. I mean, it's just at the time you're like, what was, I didn't know what to do. It was just like, it was nice that this old guy was the speaker. I got in touch with him and thought, I need to send him a letter. So I sent him a letter, and he got it about 6 months before he died.
Wow.
And I said, you'd no chance you're ever going to remember me, but here 40 years later, here is what happened. That moment has stayed with me, and I've prayed out of that. And I got such a lovely reply from him, and I'm so glad. I'm just thinking, Pete, about all these amazing people that put things into your life. You've got the three Rogers putting this. You've got Jackie, three Rogers, all these deposits, and
so grateful. So grateful.
That's awesome. So you've had the wilderness experience in the Algarve. You've had your city and urban slum experience, which I keep pulling in Hong Kong, but you are still. I was going to say, it feels like a ball in one of those casino things. You're still skirting the danger of being sucked into becoming a suburban pastor in Redhill somewhere.
The key thing in that moment of deciding to stay in this very peculiar, unlikely place called Chichester was something Roger said to me that really helped. Roger Ellis, he said, it's more important who you are called to be with than what you are called to do. And I almost entirely agree with that. I slightly disagree. I think if you're called to be a brain surgeon, you better not go and do a YWAM course. You better learn how to do it, But I think that's an incredibly important principle. And there was a sense of staying in Chichester was not the way that you were going to try and make something happen for yourself in life or ministry. But I knew I loved these people and that I could be more than myself around them. And I was weary of being the Lone Ranger. I didn't trust myself as the Lone Ranger. And whatever the future was, it had to be in community and in team. I didn't just, don't think that was a new learning. I think I'd sensed that for many years, but just growing up in Reigate and, you know, an Anglican context, none of that stuff happens. And I didn't know how to make it happen. So I was thrilled when I found that context.
Yeah, awesome. Now, is it around this time that you discovering Count Zinzendorf and
well, I first discovered him from Roger Forster, of course.
Right.
I mean, you know, you can imagine there's lovely Moravians. They prayed all night. They prayed all day. They were willing to chop their arms off for the good news of the, you know, Forster, Roger Forster, had taught me that stuff, and but then I reached this summer of discontent in 1999. Of the congregations we planted were going quite well, and I thought, if God dies, would we notice? and the stuff we're doing in the youth congregation was fairly innovative. We had DJs leading worship. We were meeting in bars and all this stuff. And I remember I was doing an interview on Radio 4 with a bishop who was outrageous. I mean, he was so rude to me live on Radio 4, saying that we were unaccountable and all the rest of it. And I thought it was nonsense, but I didn't say it because I happened to know that the local Anglican vicar hadn't met with the Bishop of Chichester for 12 years. 12 years, but it was technically more accountable than me, whilst I was meeting with someone on just a weekly basis who was asking me about my thought life and everything else. And the audacity of this bishop in front of tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of listeners, to say that I was unaccountable. He wasn't. I was furious. But I didn't. I thought, well, I'm not going to behave like you, so I didn't say any of that back to him in front of whatever. So there's all this stuff going on, and you know, I was sort of go-to preacher for a band called Delirious, and we would preach. You know, they were doing these big events, and so I sort of felt like I had some applause, a little bit of notoriety, a little bit of encouragement, success, and it terrified me that, oh, I could now spend the rest of my life doing this on the conveyor belt, and I'm still not sure if I really know Jesus. You know, it is that pattern. The in the shed in my mum's garden, and you know, in Hong Kong, change my heart, take me home, and you know, turning down the job at Red Hill Christian Fellowship because I just need to get this eye pulled out. It was still there. Do I know you yet? And I was really worried about being the guy who Jesus one day says, tell him all the stuff I'd done for him, and Jesus says, yeah, but I didn't actually know you. And so I began reading all this. I swapped some of the theology books I'd been reading for really simple books like Lauren Cunningham's Is That Really You, Lord? Just simple books, and weeping my way through them, saying, God, that's what I want. I want to be back in that place of just the wildness of the gospel and doing whatever you tell me to do. And I want to see riots and revivals. So I told Roger I need to jump off the conveyor belt, close my diary, and travel around Europe trying to connect with the strange vision that I've never told you about, that I had once when I was in Portugal, of an army of young people. I don't know what it means.
How many years have gone by for the people?
Probably about 5 years, 6
5
years, something like that. Maybe 7 years, 5, 6. So, and I felt like this great vision of an army of young people had been dialed down into just the mess of trying to make disciples of totally unchurched young adults. Every form of brokenness, and it's so slow. It was really on a good week 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but many weeks was the opposite. So that I've been trying to outwork that big vision very, very practically, and contrary to the image of Chichester, we were really dealing with the underbelly in all the best possible ways. And so Rog couldn't understand what I was trying to do, and he said, "Oh, you're just asking for a long holiday." And I was like, "No, I'm genuinely not. I might not come back. I don't know what I'm doing." But Sammy and I, we had a 1-year-old, or no, 11-month-old baby. We got in the car. We got off the ferry in Calais, and it's like, will we go left or right? And eventually we ended up. We went down to Dresden because we were doing stuff with a growing network of churches that were planting churches in youth culture called Remix and Cultural Shift. And there was a great, brilliant, very innovative punk church in Dresden called Kraftwerk, led by a guy called Carsten Wolf. And I thought, well, I'll go and see them. So we were staying in Dresden, and it was then that the Roger Forster meme came back to me of, oh, I think we're not far from that place, Herrnhut. And Sammy was sick one day. I now realize she was beginning to get sick with the brain tumor. So I said, look, you rest up. I'll take Hudson, who just turned 1 in Belgium. He turned 1, and go. There's this place called Herrnhut I want to go see. And I remember just walking around Herrnhut, and what impacted me, you asked me earlier about, have I got a sensitivity to the spirit of place? I'm not sure that I do, because it was the opposite. I've read lots of accounts of people going to Herrnhut, having these profound encounters with God, but I had nothing like that. I just thought it's so ordinary. It's like this neat little cute German village, not that different to the cuteness of Chichester's cobbled streets, right? And I just thought, if you could do something here through Count Ludwig Nikolaus von Zinzendorf and the Moravians, the 100-year prayer meeting, the converting John Wesley, first take the gospel to many nations on earth. If you do it out of here, maybe you could even do it out of Chichester. And then that thought connected with my journey of realizing the key to this dissatisfaction I'm feeling is prayer. That's it. Stop outsourcing that to old ladies. Learn to hear God for yourself. Learn to talk to him for yourself. Push into his presence and his power. And so here they are, they prayed 100 years and changed the world. And it was as simple as that. I just thought, Jason, when I get home, why don't I say, let's try doing this thing they did for 100 years for a month and see what happens. And it made perfect sense in Germany. And it seemed a dreadful idea when I got back to Chichester and realized how many hours there are in a month, and remembered that we only had 7 people at our church prayer meeting.
Wow. So Pete, when you said, in some ways things were successful at Chichester, go to speaker for Delirium. I mean, I remember that, I started to hear about you, and yet you used another word at the beginning of our interview. You talked about ghosts and haunting. And then you talked about this vision in the Algarve and this CGI superimposition. I just pictured you looking at this ministry. Did that vision, had it been haunting you and staying with you? Did you look out and think, this is not it? This is not the thing that's in it? What was going on with that vision when you were looking at things, if I can ask you that?
I mean, you have to die to a vision anyway for it to be resurrected, but it's at one level, you know, I wasn't getting out of bed every day saying, in frustration, saying, where is that? And you heard me being fairly blasé earlier. I received that word from Roger Mitchell, and I've just ignored it because it didn't fit. So I'm not, you know, I'm able to divorce myself to some extent from those mystical experiences, but absolutely it did stay with me. And it was really when 24/7 began, when this one prayer room began to spread, as we would have said back then, virally, around the world. The penny dropped. I went, oh, this is that. It's an army marching on its knees. It's a galvanization of young people, particularly across Europe, primarily to pray. That was the moment that I was, okay, this is that.
So Roger was pleased that you went back.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we'd had a prophet from America had come into the church and said there will be 24-hour prayer in this place, and you know, it'll be a resource to the nations and all this business. And that was in February of 1999. We'd completely forgotten. And then when we started 24/7 prayer, my friend Justin Blake came in with a printout of the prophecy, and it's like, oh, God said this would happen. We'd forgotten. So we felt it was part of our calling. But then pretty soon after that, Sammy got very, very sick. They were incredibly gracious to me. The church was very good to me, and that for quite a while they continued to pay me as if I was one of the leaders of the church. But what with Sammy being sick and 24/7 kicking off, I wasn't really able to do much in terms of the local church. So very gracious to me. And the church began to deconstruct around that sort of time. And so it was very weird because suddenly my life is exploding with 24/7. My life is imploding and becoming much, much smaller at the same time, with a very sick wife and two, at this stage, little kids that I'm the primary carer for. So I'm turning down going to speak at literally the biggest conferences in the world to stay home and change nappies. Thank God. And then run parallel with that, the church that has been my home, my family, my community, my resource base, my employer, is deconstructing, and I'm not really able to properly engage with it because I'm too emotionally broken by what's happening with Sammy and too preoccupied in every other way with trying to serve this movement that's unexpectedly happening. So it was a funny old thing. It probably took me 2 or 3 years to really resurface from that. It probably wasn't until I came back from America a bit later that I had a key moment. I went for a curry with Roger. You asked, was he pleased? I went for a curry with Roger, and I said to him, Rog, Sammy and I've got to work out what we do next. And you know, and what I wanted was to stay in Chichester, stay with Revs. I love those guys. I love the place. You know, I've never really burnt bridges, and I still so clearly remember saying, look, we've got these monastic communities that are starting to spring up all around the world. At the time, we called them boiler rooms. And I said, I feel as a point of integrity, I need to be part of one. Like, otherwise, you know, what am I doing? So I said, are you happy for me to plant a boiler room community as part of Revs, almost like a congregation of it? And Roger's pint was halfway to his mouth. He went, oh yeah, of course, great, yeah, brilliant, yeah, no, go for it. And then his pint paused, and he went, "You're going to nick all my leaders, aren't you?" and I said to him, "Well, that wouldn't be my heart.
Yeah,
that's not what I'd want to do." And then we both looked at each other and realized that is what will happen.
Yeah.
And I realized I haven't spent all these years serving and trying to build Revs to now divide it, when it was at a very vulnerable time anyway, with the deconstruct that had happened. They were just beginning to resurface.
Yeah.
And with great sadness, I left that curry. I came home, I said to Sammy, we've got to leave. And it's not, I knew how to leave. I'd seen lots and lots of church leaders leave because there were splits, they'd fallen out. Christianity is just like rock music, right? Bands always say they split up because of musical differences, but it never is. It's always because of relational fallout.
Yeah.
So churches say it's theological differences, but it's just someone doesn't like someone.
Yeah.
Someone's ego's got out of control.
Yeah.
But I didn't really know how to move on when we still loved each other. But anyway, so Rog gave us his full blessing, and that was the process of ending up. We thought we were going to go somewhere terribly exciting. Maybe Brighton, maybe central London, maybe a farm in Scotland, and then God supernaturally led us to Guildford. So I think Roger's always been encouraging.
Yeah.
But there's probably is a sadness we both feel that we weren't able to outwork everything that 24/7 was going to become there where it had all begun.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing that. So, so Pete, a little step back. I think chronologically it is a step back. I think out of everything that you've produced and written, the vision prayer that you scrawled anonymously on a wall in the prayer room in Chichester at 3 a.m. that's gone viral. What were you aware of in that moment when you wrote that? Were you expressing angst? Did you feel the presence of God? Was it was it a similar moment to the one you had in the Algarve? What, or did you just need to get something off your chest?
Yeah, just Red Bull, 3 a.m. Red Bull. It was the thought of what my atheist friends would make of me being awake in the middle of the night talking to the wall, as they would perceive it. Like, what is this madness? What is this absurdity? That wasn't just, to be honest, about 24/7. As we've been talking, you can see that it's my life. What is this absurdity that I question and yet consistently abandon myself to, called faith? And so that's why I started writing, so this guy comes up to me, says, what's the vision? What's the big idea? So in my head, that wasn't a sycophant, that was someone who's a bit antagonistic. What the hell do you think you're doing? Like, what's the big idea? I open my mouth and the words come out like this. The vision is Jesus. Dangerously, obsessively, undeniably Jesus. The vision is an army of young people. You see bones, I see an army, and so on. And so I wrote these words up, and I kind of knew they were good. Like, I was excited by what I was writing. It wasn't a mystical experience. I was a little razzed up on caffeine and probably was a little more rah than even back then my theology would have permitted if it hadn't been 3 a.m. on a lot of Red Bull. But I was reading Brennan Manning, for crying out loud. Brokenness, grace, fragility of faith and humanity. And then those words, I didn't sign them. They were just written on the wall. It was a long old poem, prayer, rant thing, but people liked them and clearly began to email them to friends, and they got out and spread around the world. And the first I knew was, the prayer room was on the ground floor of this warehouse. We had an office immediately above it. I was sitting in the office and I received an email from someone in Canada saying, I found this thing on the internet and I thought you'd like it. And so someone was emailing me my own words from the room downstairs. They're still on the wall downstairs via Canada. And then they really did get out, and DJs around the world were recording and remixing them. And I was in Sweden, and a guy, I think we broke into a recording studio in the middle of the night, and he got me to read them, and we recorded the words, and it got right out, and no one knew where it had come from. I remember I was in Spain at a conference, 1,000 young people, and watching this dance, and realizing these are Americans. They were from Tulsa, Oklahoma, big butch, muscly, big booted guys doing this stomp kind of dance with a guy screaming into a microphone in Spanish. And I began to realize, oh, it's my poems thing. And so it was quite wild. And probably at that stage, what was happening with the vision was more amazing than what was happening 24/7. We had, a handful of other places saying, we want to do this thing too, but the vision was going everywhere. And then eventually a so-called prophet in America announced that he had written the poem and dropped the name of his ministry. And I just wrote to him and said, you're lying. Can you, take it down? And that was when I had fessed up and said, look, we've realized it was a prophecy that God had given me somehow. And so we said that I wrote it, and it came from a prayer room. We felt like people maybe needed to know that. And so that was the vision poem. And I think it was a sort of call to arms for a while for a lot of people. It galvanized probably a type of spirituality that was a little more visceral and wild than people were used to, but something that people were actually longing for.
Yeah. Well, Pete, I've worked you hard, and we're pivoting to the home straight here. And if I can pivot around a question with Sammy, because I've been married 30 years and been through many things since I was 19 when we were dating. And I know what it's like as a couple to navigate those moments in life when you have to make big decisions about your future, because you just know that God wants you to do it. But I just know there are those moments I couldn't have made some decisions without a wife who was hear from God before me, or say, yes, we have to do this, or we might as well die.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing, so as Sammy's writ large in your writing and health issues and other stuff, but day to day with your partner in the gospel, as she is, what were those moments like for you, even before she was ill, where you're going, what was that like for you as a couple when you talked about those moments? You come home, you say, I think we need to, what does Sammy say? What was it? How did you partner together around that?
It's back to that thing of how different we are, and she's enormously, I'm quite future orientated, she's very present. So actually, I remember when we were engaged, sensing that the Lord might be, calling me to some frontier mission, somewhere, and coming back and saying to Sammy, so, like, are you up for, if God calls us once we're married to, some tribe somewhere? And she just said, no, I'm not up for that. I'm like, oh no. So if God calls me, but you're not willing to go, like, maybe we shouldn't get married. So we have this like process. And eventually I say to her, so you're saying to me, if God told you to move and serve this tribe, you'd say no? She said, no. If God tells me, I'll go. Earlier, you said, like, if Pete says to me, and so she I think you framed some of my story as a bit of an adventure thing. I don't think she feels that. She's super content in the present moment. But she actually does go on great adventures. I mean, we've just done this crazy thing the last year or so. we spend just over half our life living on a barge now, 60-foot long, 9-foot wide barge, and the other half on a cliff top on the Isle of Wight as a place of reflection and retreat and hospitality. Is where I am now, and it's nuts. Like, who does that? But Sammy's gone with it every step of the way. She's up for it. She's loved it. She loves it still. You know, the other night, the electrics on the barge packed up. We're doing everything by candlelight. She's amazing. So she's so good for me at every level. And I'm just so grateful. We don't pray together very much. People were surprised by that. But we're just wired differently. And partly years of her being sick, she has to sleep a lot. It's just hard to find that. We do pray together, don't get me wrong, but we don't have a disciplined, joint quiet time every day. People often envisage that's the ideal for married couples, and maybe it is, but we've never managed that. But she's now training as just qualified as a counselor, and is just unbelievably good with, listening to people, binding up broken hearts, much better than me and all of that stuff. So, yeah.
Awesome. So, yeah, I'm going to ask you about God on mute and prayer, and we'll land on the question. But when we've been doing these interviews with people, a raft of amazing Christian leaders, I say, from the church world, academic world, prayer world. It's amazing. Two of the interviewees almost died from meningitis in childbirth. 2 were adopted out of homes for single mothers and never knew their natural fathers. 2 had fathers who died during their childhood. 2 dynamic, clever women left abusive, violent relationships with men, with one with a child under their arm. 1 guest used to go to sleep at the age of 8, listening to the man who was his father but wasn't, listening to him beating up his mother. Another one woke up on a Monday to discover that she'd left to start a new life in England for him, but they were eventually reunited. 2 experienced enormous racism. 1 was in a community church where the police would fit up young black men for crimes they hadn't committed. Another one was told he wasn't a good boyfriend prospect because of his race. 1 was driving within the speed limit on an A road, and a cyclist who didn't see him went through his windscreen and he got his blood all over him and died, and that catalyzed him into ministry. 1 grew up in a loving household with a terminally ill sister who died slowly over a decade, and had their faith refined through that. And another watched their mother die slowly of cancer over more than a decade and became their carer. It's been so profound in these interviews with very public people, of this constant backdrop of suffering and loss that has shaped their faith and spirituality profoundly. And I guess, in the one sense, before I ask my question, I think it's that people think that God's work in our lives should be the absence of that. But when you start to ask people who have encountered God and pressed into pursuing him, it's so redolent, and that suffering's there. I joked about Harry Potter with you. J.K. Rowling's mother was diagnosed and died early from multiple sclerosis. I mean, again, suffering that catalyzes things. So, and you have focused in your writing and talked a lot about the need for Christians to be discerning about what they treasure and have set their lives on. And can you tell us, at this point of the interview, as we're near the end, just what happened to Sammie, and at the heart of that, with your personal experience of suffering, what has that meant for you in your orientation of faith to Jesus, this Jesus that you're passionate about and obsessed about? How is that part of the warp and weft of who you are? Easy question for you.
Yeah, I mean, if the vision at Cape St. Vincent was one of the defining moments of my life, Sammie's brain tumour has been the other. Yeah, I mean, Danny, our second son, was 7 weeks old.
Sammy woke in the night having a fit, a seizure, rushed into hospital. And my worst fear at that point was that for some strange reason, Sammy was developing epilepsy. And then we find out she's got a very large brain tumor, the size of an orange in her head, that they didn't know if they could operate on. That was a long wait. And we're incredibly lucky compared to many people, in that eventually they were able to operate, and they did get most of it out. And the brain tumor hasn't grown back. And I almost struggle to talk about that sometimes, because so many people have a much harder story than that. Our battle really has been with epilepsy ever since. You know, and for a long time, Sammy was having multiple very serious seizures. You think of status epilepticus, where you go into a cycle of fits, which is very, really dangerous. And so, you know, the disco van taking us into hospital on a regular basis, and this sort of almost sort of schizophrenic sort of reality of moving from, you know, incredible miraculous answers to prayer, you know, documentaries, you know, Rolling Stone and Channel 4, you know, and USA Today, and front page of the first edition of Relevant magazine, and at the same time as sitting by my wife's bed again and again, watching her slipping into a fit, crying out to God to make it stop, and it not working, and trying to raise the kids, and probably being quite sleep deprived just from that. I mean, it was the extremes. If that doesn't do something to your theology, you're not in touch with yourself. And I think what it did was I pretty quickly went from the vision poem, rah, 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 tub thumping guy going around the world, getting everyone yelling, come on, to the guy who sort of shuffled up to the platform and found that the people who wanted to talk to me afterwards were perhaps the meek and the poor in spirit, and those who'd messed up and those who are broken. And I think, you know, that experience did things to my eschatology. It certainly did something very strong to my Christology. And it deeply shaped me pastorally. I hope I am understanding and kinder and softer as a result. So, and I just, God just isn't that tidy for me anymore. I think one of the big shifts is, for me, is I find a great intimacy in the distance and the sovereignty and the transcendence of God that I find quite hard to articulate. But I can best capture it by saying that sometimes when I'm standing out under the stars, I whisper with a sense that God is utterly other and beyond my comprehension, and feel him very close. It's a long way from the simplistic radical Jesus, I think, that I came back from Hong Kong with, and the Daddy, God will make everything better vision that perhaps I had developed in the interim years. So yeah, and that does segue into the contemplative prayer stuff, because, you know, if your vision of prayer is just a big red switch that you've got to flick, if you try hard enough and fast for long enough and quote enough Bible verses, it just doesn't work. Sorry. But if prayer is somehow about becoming, and experiencing the presence of God with you in the valley of the shadow, that makes sense to me profoundly.
Awesome. I'm going to wrap up with 3 short questions. So much more I would love to have asked you, but I've had you for a lot of time, and thank you, Pete, for everything you shared. So I'm going to just gloss over. You spent 7 years as the director of prayer at another major British Christian institution, up with Holy Trinity Brompton, who run the Alpha course. And then you've obviously gone from there, planted the Emmaus Church in Guildford, and now this leads me to the first of my last 3 questions. And you talked about the contemplative, the order of the mustard seed, which is a lay order, and this emphasis on contemplative prayer, and seeing this maturation in your own life, but development in the prayer life of 24/7. And you've gone from this extroverted style of prayer and becoming much more introverted, and you mapped that out wonderfully through the interview. But if I can ask you a question, within the order of the mustard seed, you've now got you've got a rule of faith. You know, people will be familiar with maybe Benedict's rule. Why does here's my question: why does Christianity need a rule? What purpose does it serve, and what?
We need boundedness on the chaos, and or maybe you can frame it like this. We have to rediscover the second naivety. You know, we have to move from the complexity of Christianity back to find out what is it at heart and how do I do it. And you know, for me, you know, our rule is incredibly simple. It's at heart, it's true to Christ, kind of people, gospel to the nations. It's the 3 loves: love God, love others, love the lost. So it's not rocket science. And then we have a practice, 6 practices that orbit those 3 core commitments. So I think people need a rule because we need a shape of living. We need to know how to do what we are aspiring to do. And then secondly, which touches on the other aspect of the religious order, we must understand the power of promising. And most of us, when we became followers of Jesus, no one explained to us that this is a covenant commitment. And we always talk about the order of the mustard seed as a little way for weak people. You know, many of my friends don't feel the need of it, and I respect that. But I just know that I do. I needed the clarity, focus, and the power of promising to galvanize and hold me in through the storms of life.
Yeah, it's funny when I try to well, not funny, when other people ask me about a rule, when I get to teaching theological context and seminary students and stuff, one of the things I'll do them will say, you know, we all live by rules.
Yeah.
And I do an exercise of them, you know, when I'll eat, what I won't do, how I make decisions. You just already have rules about what you're going to do. It's like, it's that pre-deciding thing, isn't it? And we've mentioned Jill Webber. I absolutely, in COVID in this last year, Jill's book undid me on prayer. It was just, I got to the chapter when she gets to her abuse, but of course at first I remember reading it, and then I paused. I had to go back and go forward and back. But then there was just this pre-decision that, you know, when she goes out into the woods and says, God, the answer's yes. Now what do you want to say to me? I mean, again, just that stunning orientation of, right, Lord, I'll center my life around a few things so that everything else can take its order from that.
Yeah, she is phenomenal. And that's right. I think you're exactly right. Everyone lives by rule, and it's the intentionality, and it is the power of promising and committing. And most of us are so scared of committing ourselves to things that we miss our lives 1 year at a time. But this is where we started, you know, the conversation is we have to think in not just in years, but decades, and probably even in centuries. And none of us as free as we want to think. So let's embrace that and celebrate that. So the Order of the Mustard Seed. I've been a member since 2005, and I can honestly say that it is of more value to me with every passing year.
I bet it is. I bet it is. Right, my second and my three last questions. So you've handed on the leadership of 24/7 prayer. You've told us that you are living on a barge half the year and on the cliff tops of the Isle of Wight the other bit. I was going to say, what's the you're into your 50s now. In this, if having portrayed your life as an adventure, I was about to say, what's the adventure at the moment? So what's the, has God directed you into something at the minute? How did you end up on a barge and on the cliffs of the Isle of Wight? What is the adventure that you and Sammy have said yes to at this stage?
Well, there's an inward journey and outward journey. The inward journey is a profound transformation. God spoke to me a few years ago, said it's time to start passing things on. I was sick and tired of Christian leaders who got that wrong, who either were a cork in the bottle, would never let go of anything, or just kind of abandoned things that they had mothered or fathered and left people feeling orphaned. And I was like, there's got to be a better way of doing this. And as you'll have picked up from my story, I've started lots of things. I've started, well, we relaunched the Order of the Mustard Seed, planted churches, 24/7, much to all of our surprise, has become what it has, and so on. And so the picture God gave me was of an orchard with the trees coming to fruit at different times. And I knew the first thing to pass on was the Order of the Mustard Seed. And Jill Webber now is the global convener, can be for another 2 years, do a maximum 2-3 year terms in that role. And it's just going from strength to strength, so much better than when I was trying to run it. And I've not found that difficult at all to pass that on. I'm just a member. I have no power at all. I have authority. I'm not kidding myself about that, but I have no power. And then the next thing I knew was 24/7 prayer. I'm just not a very good CEO. My problem is I'm not bad enough for them to sack me. So I've muddled through for the years. Now, the other part of your question, that's the inward journey within me, is I think I'm learning how to be a father spiritually to people. I'm learning how people don't want my words that much anymore. They want my arm around their shoulder. But the other side is the outward adventure is we're building a monastery. And it's a very, very, very big project. So I'm about to go and take a sabbatical, my first one in 25 years, from September through to December. And then when I come back, front and center will be establishing a house of prayer for Europe that's also a business incubator and a Christian university.
Awesome. Wow, exciting. And you're writing a book, aren't you?
Yeah.
Painfully watching you lead all over Facebook. Did you get it done in the end?
Mate, I don't know. How do you find it? I'm so slow. I'm such a slow writer. And it just doesn't get easier. I thought it'd get easier. It doesn't get easier. So I just finished 70,000 words on how to hear God. Yeah. Awesome. And sent it off to the publisher, and now it's all the toing and froing.
And coming out when? When's that coming out?
It'll come out in January. Yeah, they want it, or before I go on sabbatical, they want everything sort of in the can, and
we're looking forward to it. Right, almost done with my final question, but I would just literally week before this, my wife and I got the second part of our 30th wedding anniversary. A benefit of COVID, we discovered Narrowboats because our 30th wedding anniversary last year got cancelled. So we had a week last year. One now. And we went, and now we're going to be doing it all, as often as we can, because it just slows you down.
Tell me what dimensions is it?
We've now got a share in a boat that is 60 feet long and 6'4" wide. Beautiful.
So it's a proper narrowboat.
Proper narrowboat. Yeah.
Good for you.
But this will make you. I mean, you know what it's like. So we were out 2 weeks ago, and something went wrong on the boat, and we needed to call someone out, to come and fix it. And we'd gone down to Braunston, and we took 5 days to get to this location. And the guy said, we're in Braunston, and I thought, oh, 5 days. You lose a sense of time. I was like, it's going to take him forever to get here. And he said, I'll see you in half an hour.
I know. Yeah, I've had exactly the same. And my sort of A-type, thing I'm trying to get free of. The first day or two of really cruising on the barge and seeing people, dog walkers, overtaking me. I catch myself revving, and who are you trying to beat here? Like, where are you trying to get? If this is a race, give up on the boat and cycle. Yeah.
You're going to start canal boat racing, but slow and furious.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, you're trying to achieve world-changing things. The mission, and as you and I, there are many Christian leaders I've met who are willing to throw a lot of bodies under a bus to do that, but it seems that you're not. And I know you've got the rule of kindness, but what's going on there for you in relationships for that priority? What's that all about? Finish.
We'll all attend each other's funerals, and all that will matter is how well we loved. I mean, yes, we want to change the world, but not at any price. And if the price of changing the world is using people and doing year zero on your relationships every 5 years, it's not worth the price. And this is maybe also the contemplative thing. What if the great thing that changes the world is to become something rather than to achieve something? Maybe this touches on the much younger me saying, I don't want to be the guy who says, look at all I did, and you say, I never knew you. Ultimately, who I am is my greatest contribution to the world, and I cannot be me without those around me. So, and it's so much more fun. I mean, you very sweetly sort of used this Harry Potter motif, but we do tune into the Lord of the Rings a lot. And what I love about the Hobbits is they go on these adventures. Deep down, they still want to be back in the Shire, and they don't really expect to succeed, but at least they've got a story to tell. And I don't mind too much whether I leave behind me a trail of world-conquering success or, tragic failure, actually, as long as it's a jolly good story and as long as I can still tell it with my friends. And so that is, I think that's one of the insights that God gave us near the start that I'm so grateful for. I know lots of these famous leaders, even some of them you've interviewed, and they're good people, but some of them are some of the loneliest people I've ever met, and they don't have many really good friendships, and I think that's an absolute tragedy. And it slightly calls into question what the gospel is for. If at heart, our faith is a faith that's all about friendship.
Yeah. Wow. Well, what an awesome place for us to finish. Thank you for telling your story in this extended format here, and for being open and transparent and sharing your heart. And it really has been a privilege, Pete. And may God bless you with many slow journeys now, and the ability to write at whatever pace you need to for all the new things God's got for you there. Bless you. So thank you, Pete.
Oh, it's been a pleasure to talk. Thank you. I'm sure. Well, I just hope it's made a little sense.
Been awesome. Thanks, Pete. Bye. We hope you enjoyed that, and we have many other interviews with amazing guests where we listen attentively and respectfully to discover people's backstories through their beliefs and life experiences and find out what shaped them into who they are and inspires what they do. You can catch all those interviews by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can find audio versions in your podcast platform of choice: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, etc. Just search Extra ECC. Of course, you can go to extraecc.com and sign up for our newsletter and find all our social media links and more. And by the way, all links are in our show notes below.